Thank you all for having me up here. What Tim didn't mention is I'm from Washington, D.C., where it is equally hot, but I am enjoying being in this room because my air conditioning hasn't been working on and off for the past month. Currently getting a new HVAC system, so any opportunity I have to be in air conditioning is great, but thank you for having me. As Tim mentioned, I am the director of the National Complete Streets Coalition. I also work at Smart Growth America, where I serve as the vice president of Thriving Communities. And this idea that really we're not just about transportation or land use or housing or kind of anything you fall into that, policy, whether it's implementation, but at the end of the day, we're about creating places where people can thrive. Smart Growth America does this through a bunch of different programs. You can see up there we have programs like the National Complete Streets Coalition, which I'll talk about, Transportation for America, that really leads on a lot of our transportation policy at the state and federal level. Our Local Leaders Council, which is a network of locally elected leaders from across the United States interested in smart growth. Locus, which is our responsible real estate development program that I know Jason and others are a part of and support. And then the Governor's Institute on Community Design, where we work with governors across the country on, again, smart growth implementation and policy. We also recently acquired the Form-Based Code Institute, and I heard you had a presentation about form-based code this morning. So really, again, we work in all these different puzzle pieces because at the end of the day, it's not just, and I love transportation, I'm definitely a transportation nerd, but see, it's one of the pieces to creating a place, again, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about is not just transportation, but that we're in the business of making places. I like to just put a plug out for my own program, the National Complete Streets Steering Committee, and the National Complete Streets Coalition and the Steering Committee, because we're a group that actually predated our involvement with Smart Growth America. We're actually founded by groups like AARP and the American Public Transit Association, the National Association of Realtors, groups like the Institute of Transportation Engineers. You can kind of see everyone. We've now got state departments of transportation, we have cities, we have health groups, because this idea was really, and complete streets are, this idea that regardless of who you are or how you travel, you have that choice to get from where you are, say it's your house, to where you want to be, whether it's your job, it's school, it's where you pray or worship, it's where you need health care. It's where you just want to socialize with your friends, that you can get there in a safe, reliable, convenient, affordable way in a reasonable amount of travel time. And it's really that, a lot of people either want that choice or don't have the ability to get there in other ways. I always say it's not about making every street this idea of, having protected bike lanes and a bus lane, and a car travel lane, but it's about, again, I have that choice somewhere in my network, somewhere in that community, and that they look like they're appropriate for the community that you're living in. I live in Washington, D.C. within the city, but I live in a really residential neighborhood that actually is on a bus route too. It's really strange. But there's no need we have sidewalks, but there's no need for things like bike lanes, because generally the speed, I think actually the fastest moving vehicle on that street is the bus. But because it's appropriate kind of for the children, we have a lot of children in our neighborhood, and they bike and they play and they run, and that's just as appropriate as, the protected bike lane and bus lane in front of my office in downtown DC. We do a lot of work on, I always say we kind of have three tiers. We work in really a lot of technical assistance, which then we're really working on building thought leaders, and I'll talk about some of our reports, and then eventually doing advocacy, getting complete streets policies around the country. We now have 1,400 complete streets policies in the United States, represented in all 50 states, in Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. So we're seeing a lot of momentum for these policies. And really these policies, again, are about setting the framework to create place. And I've talked about place a lot, but I actually wanted to throw that out there, that what is place? This is actually a picture. Does anyone know where this is? Yeah, it is Marrakesh. Have you been there?
No, I've been to Morocco, but not Marrakesh.
Yeah, so I didn't take this picture, although I have been there. And this is in a one-way place. This is like the biggest market I've ever been to, and it's in the Medina, the old city of Marrakesh, Morocco, and it's got this old market, and in a way that's place. This is also place, but is it the place we're talking about? And then actually this is from right near where I live. This is a transit-oriented development in an area called Columbia Heights in Washington, D.C. There's a metro right there. There's a Target. There's housing. There's retail. There's restaurants. There's a gym. There's just about, and people, this is actually really doesn't depict how well used this square is. In the summertime, we have a farmer's market there on Saturdays, but these are all places. And place really matters. And I think when we're thinking about creating the places that we want and the places that people want and places that people can thrive, we have to remember why place matters. Place matters for the economy. And I got to sit in, I know Jason did a presentation this morning that talked a lot about how we're seeing how it's changing the real estate and development market. This is a report that Smart Growth America did with Cushman Wakefield that actually interviewed 500 CEOs about why they're locating their businesses where they are. And they're moving to downtowns because and they're moving into kind of walkable cities because that's where their talent wants to go. When they're talking about, both recruiting and retaining talent, people want to live in walkable communities. I got to go to Arkansas for the first time this year, but I was in Bentonville. And does anyone know why? I'm sure someone knows why Bentonville is Walmart. So Bentonville is like, and the surrounding areas, Fayetteville, their downtowns are incredible. Like if you had told me I was in Arkansas, like just because in my head I have an idea, actually, and perhaps, not an accurate view of Arkansas, I was shocked. They actually want to make it, the Waltons who own Walmart want to make it one of the most bikeable places in the world. They're also trying to make it a premier an art center. They have a huge museum, but that was in part because they knew that to bring people to Arkansas, like me, who are like, ooh, Arkansas, they needed to create a community that they would want to move to, and we've seen this again throughout the country. Place also matters because it affects safety. The Complete Streets Coalition puts out this report called Dangerous by Design that shows the 50 most dangerous states and the 100 most dangerous metropolitan areas in the United States. I have to thank ARP because they're always the primary sponsor of this report. But what it shows is, again, place matters. When you look at the most dangerous places, they often have really car-centric land use, very suburban land use, and we're seeing that most of those fatalities are happening on those big kind of wide, we call them like wide, straight, fast streets. Oh, sorry, this thing is. And so, we're also, has anyone heard of the Urban Land Institute? We're doing a report with them right now, stay tuned in the next couple months, called Unhealthy Corridors. That essentially we have these places, and you probably instantly know when I start to describe an unhealthy corridor because we all have them, are these they're very suburban land use, there's lots of parking, they're often though not thriving economically, there's a lot of kind of vacant store lots, they're very unsafe. Usually cars are traveling very fast, and these, again, those places matter for those people because we're showing that there's the health outcomes, the CO2 around those communities, but also the safety, the economic opportunity. So it matters a lot. And then it affects health. So I typed this in. There's this idea called your zip code determines your health outcomes. Does that sound familiar? And I was actually first introduced to this because I am from Seattle, Washington. And I was working for the King County government at the time when they first started to talk about this idea of place affects your health. And I lived in an upper middle class neighborhood near the University of Washington. It was also probably 5 minutes away from the bridge that took you to Microsoft, just to give you a sense of the socioeconomic demographics. We're right next to this beautiful arboretum, and our convenience store was like an organic market. So you can imagine we had health outcomes or life expectancy of countries in Scandinavia, which are considered like the healthiest people in the countries in the world. And I worked for an elected official, and she represented an area around the airport. It was a majority minority area. It had high pockets of poverty. It had often no sidewalks. It had a lot of air pollution, light pollution, bad transit service. And we looked at the life expectancy, and they had a the same, and I could drive between these two in 15 minutes, by the way. The people in that community had a life expectancy of people in developing countries. And it was totally based on place. They had no access to healthy food. They couldn't walk to the transit stop. So I typed this in. This is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but this is, if you typed in your zip code in Chester County, and just keep those numbers in mind. Those are actually really high. Then they pulled up this comparison, and this is Philadelphia. Is kind of the distance in life expectancy depending on where you live in the city. And if you know the city, you'll know kind of the differences between 191, I think 32, or if you're going up to, I can't read, where you're 88 years old. But just in those short distances, the life expectancy there. And then places are changing. I heard Jason talk about this. I'm sure many more of you talked about this. We also have modes that are changing, as Lisa talked about, but demographics are changing. We have economies that are changing. We have preferences that are changing. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I love that you set me up for this, Jason. So this is another way to look at, we have demographic changes going on. So this is actually, so I love, you kind of talked about where we are. We have a huge population of baby boomers and millennials who are driving a lot of the market right now. This actually shows that the population is we know the population is going to go up by 2060, but it's going to be largely driven by people age 65 and plus, when you see this chart there. And that the demographics, so we can see in 2016, the boomer millennial population, then in 2019, but then as the boomers die out, it's replaced by, I didn't know another way to put that. I'm up there too. I'm not, to out myself, I'm neither a boomer or a millennial, so I always feel odd talking about them. But the millennials will kind of take over. And so that's something to keep in mind. I know I'm in that, like the weird Gen X thing. But we also have changing preferences. This is interesting. So the National Association of Realtors, who sits on our steering committee, does this report every year where they ask, it's like housing preferences. Their members want to know what people want. That's their business. And this shows that the majority of people are saying places like sidewalks and places to take walks, bike lanes and paths nearby, short commute to work, so you kind of have to take these all. Actually, public transit is over 50%, somewhat important or very important to people. We also have, again, these millennials who are saying, they'd rather live in a city or suburb with a mix of houses, but there's still many who would also like to live in a rural community. And this is interesting. I think there's almost this desire for like city or suburban with a mix and then the rural, and that many people are kind of moving away from this more suburban neighborhood with houses only, and that the boomers also want many of the same things. I think about this because I have to personalize everything to understand it, like I think many of us do. So my sister is a millennial, and she definitely has, she has actually lived in both rural. She went to school in a very rural community and didn't have a car. But then she's chosen her adult life to live in cities like New York, or now she's back in Seattle because she actually doesn't want to have a car. And she's made that choice, and it's a lifestyle choice for her. She has zero interest. She actually doesn't have a license, which is a point of contention in my family, because my mom is getting old, and I'm like, so someone has to take her to the doctor, and I'm not going to move back, so could you at least get your license? And then my mom, who I just mentioned, is still in the house I grew up in, and she loves this house. she has a beautiful garden. She's actually losing her vision. So she's going to have to make a choice because we don't live in a particularly great walkable neighborhood, whether she can stay there or not. And she wants to be able to stay in that house. She owns that house outright. It makes sense for her. She has all of our memories. But at some point, if she can't get around, she's going to have to make that choice, or my sister will have to get a license, but that's probably not a long-term solution. And then, the high cost of transportation, I loved your statistic because it was a little bit different, the one-car household, but then this is 9% of households don't own a car at all. I'm actually one of those as well. My household does not own a car. But what this doesn't show is actually the burden of car ownership on people. So it's most households' second biggest expense, transportation is, after housing. But for low-income families, it can be the majority expense because as housing prices go up, because we do want to live in these walkable communities, people are actually moving farther and farther out, and they're moving away from transit services. And so they actually have to own cars to be able to access jobs, but often that car ownership is offsetting the job altogether. And then there's just changing travel patterns. I was actually really surprised to see this. We just pulled this up the other day, is that walking is going slightly up, but people biking to work is going up even more rapidly in this country. And then the labor force, this again goes back to people wanting to move to places and then get a job versus the other way around. So I graduated, to date myself, so I graduated college in 2001. And not only was the economy it was not a good time to get a job, but I knew that I was going to go wherever I could get a job, right? I just needed to have a job. My mom would so I moved home temporarily, and every day my mom would bring me home a different job application. It's somewhere she drove past because she's like, you got to get out of here. But that I have hired multiple employees who have moved to DC before they have a job, which blows my mind. They move to DC and then look for work because they want to live there. And then safety. So we have an increase, and we have a huge kind of pedestrian safety crisis in this country. I think last year, around 7,000 people, between 6,000 and 7,000 people died while walking on streets in the United States, and it's going up rapidly even as overall traffic fatalities go down. So we've actually seen a big increase in overall fatalities going down. And that means that people inside vehicles are actually dying less. We're building better cars, but we're not building better transportation systems. And so we're seeing an increase. We're also seeing that this comes out in terms of who's impacted. In our Dangerous by Design report, we see that older adults and people of color are disproportionately represented in pedestrian fatalities. And that holds true throughout the country. And then we see, this is another way kind of at looking at the annual pedestrian fatalities per 100,000 people. So white, non-Hispanic, and Asian, they're a little under one. And once you go to Hispanic, African American, or the Native American, you're way overrepresented in pedestrian fatalities. I also mentioned we looked at the most dangerous places. Can anyone guess where they are? Rural areas. Well, these are states. South. The South and Delaware. I know. I thought I could show, because sometimes it's we're no, yeah, Delaware is up there. And then the green are the least dangerous places. So I think it's interesting to think about that, which is not funny, but you're actually much more likely to be struck and killed walking in Delaware than you are in Pennsylvania. Or many other parts of the country. And then we have public health. So we actually put this, map together recently that looked at, this is so interesting. If you look at the top, it's the age-adjusted obesity percentage. So the darker the area, the higher percentage of the population is obese. And Unsurprisingly, you see it concentrated in the south. I don't know if this has a, right, so here. And then down here is age-adjusted diabetes. Again, same place. And then look at the same for physical inactivity. And this just kind of graphically shows the places that are moving the least have the highest rates of obesity and diabetes. Unfortunately, they also have some of the most or the least pedestrian and bicycle friendly transportation in the country. And I think there's a high correlation between all of these. We also know that 1/3 of kids and teens are overweight. Also, the CDC came out with a report last year. So 4 out of 10 Americans are obese, and 7 out of 10, the majority of us, are overweight. And this doesn't just have personal effects. This is affecting our workforce. People are calling in sick. We have higher insurance claims. There's actually been a report. There's 2 reports that have come out showing that the majority of military eligible age populations are not fit to serve in the military. There's one report that a group of retired generals called Mission Readiness put out called Too Fat to Fight. And then the Citadel actually just published a very similar report where I think it's around 75% of the age-eligible population cannot pass the basic physical fitness test for the Army. So you can see these have economic, national security, health impacts, and they just have those basic livability impacts, just that feeling that the feeling of being healthy and being able to socialize and get out there. We also have this new economy. We've talked about this, I think we're hearing a lot about this, but we are a creative, we're moving to this kind of creative, knowledge-based economy. I'm kind of lucky. I feel like in transportation, we're still a carryover from the old economy. But, I mentioned I'm from Seattle, and it was oh, that's how you make money. You work in this creative knowledge economy. But that at the same time, our development patterns, and I'll get more into this, also are they're at odds with the way that our preferences, our safety, our economy, the way everything is going right now, because low-density suburban development doesn't pay for itself. Someone was talking about this in the back this morning, is that often it's cheaper to build up front, but over time, it's a lot more expensive. And the burden doesn't fall on the developers or on the individual homeowners. It falls on all of us. So how do we address changing places? I talk a lot about, we are from Smart Growth America. So, again, I see smart growth as really, it's creating neighborhoods where you have choices in your jobs, shops, and schools. But it's also where you put public and private investment that supports existing neighborhoods and anticipated growth. Planning investments that protect the things we value. And these are all values so much as strategies. Oh, and that create places where people can thrive no matter who they are or where they live. And they protect the environment. And they build economic strength by reducing public spending on infrastructure and helping to create places that appeal to investors right now and over time. And this is what I wanted to delve a little bit more into, is the cost savings of smart growth development, because we're talking about transit-oriented development, and in a way it's the same thing. The savings on infrastructure is often around 38%. This is from a report we did called Building Better Budgets. Savings on service is 10%, but the revenue generated is on average 10 times higher than a non-smart growth development. This is one example of showing, we did a report for the Macon-Bibb County and School District, or schools combined, and we just showed the budget impacts to the county if we did low density greenfield, so that's going out there and that's building new subdivisions, putting schools out there, versus high density greenfield, downtown infill, and then downtown infill premium. And why is that? If you think about it, and it's so, the first time I saw these, I was like, whoa, that's nuts. But then if you think about it, what's happening is, let's say a school decides it gets really cheap piece of land. And it's like, great, we're going to build the school out there, and then there's going to be some housing that follows. Well, what you're not thinking about is so there's got to be sewer lines and fiber optics, and somebody's got to go pick up their trash, and we've got to have fire and EMS and police, not to mention the new roads you're going to have to build up there. And over time, they end up costing a lot of money. And if you think about it, so I live in a city. And my garbage, I live in one of those like classic DC row homes. And so like our trash is in the alley and each trash can is about 3 feet apart from each other. But for them, they're driving out, but I don't pay, I pay the same as, I don't pay less because my neighbor's trash can is 3 feet apart than someone who lives out in a more greenfield suburban development. So that's where you start to see that, the difference. I'm also, if you're in these downtown infill and downtown infill premium, or where if you're living in DC, you're also paying more. You're paying more in taxes. You're paying more in property taxes, and so that's a benefit to the city. I'm just going to give one example, and it's from Nashville because I know this one really well. We did a fiscal impact analysis looking at revenue and cost between 3 different neighborhoods. I don't know if anybody knows Nashville very well. But we looked at the Bradford Hills, which as you can see from this is kind of a classic subdivision. We looked at Lenox Village, which was kind of a new urbanist development, but it was still out there. It was a greenfield. And then we looked at this area called the Gulch. It's right adjacent to downtown. And it's walkable to downtown. It's definitely a downtown premium infill. It is the place to go at night too. If you're down there, if you want to get off of like Main Street, the honky tonk, you would go there. And we looked at again the revenue again versus the cost. So you can see in Bradford Hills, which was the typical kind of suburban subdivision many of us are familiar with. It actually was, the revenue was just a little bit more than the cost per acre. But then Lenox Village, it was again about the same. But then look at the revenues compared to the cost per acre in the Gulch. And so when we're thinking about as cities, where do we want to incentivize growth? From a purely, I don't know any city budget that is, that is just flush with cash. I don't think that's even possible anymore, unless for some reason you're Bentonville and Walmart. So in every place I go, I'm like, people are like, funding is our #1 issue. Funding is our #1 issue. And there we were talking about, they're like, oh, the Waltons will just pay for that. I was like, oh, well then. And then we looked at, so what cost categories might vary by density? So most of these, so libraries, hospitals, and parks might not, but the fire, the roads, stormwater, sewer and water, solid waste, and schools, these are all highly dependent, the cost on density. We did another, so speaking of place, a couple of years ago, we did another report called Amazing Place, where we looked at places, and these are not just the New York cities, amazing places, and why they were. So we did Nashville again, just to keep with the theme, but they've really capitalized on just this idea of they are the country music capital. It's really interesting because I've spent a ton of time in Tennessee over the last year, and everyone else within the state of Tennessee is like poo-poos on Nashville. They're like, Memphis is the real country capital, and right? But they capitalized on this, and now they are growing at like a ridiculous, they're one of the fastest growing cities in the country, and their housing cannot keep up with that. And people, again, want to live in these more dense developments. But then you have Greenville, South Carolina, which is totally different than Nashville, but it's really capitalized on this idea of when you build out a main street and you start to invest in density, they're seeing a population boom, and people love going there. So it can happen in big cities or medium-sized and small cities. I'm not going to read that, But a lot of what we believe is that you can accomplish this through smart growth. That essentially we're in the business of creating places. I think many of us are familiar with the tools because you work in it. It's development, it's in land use, it's in creating transportation. But it's this idea, again, of creating places. And I think is that getting out of kind of the silos of what we do and to think about what place we're trying to create and then for who. Which I think is going to become it is a really big issue right now because one of the things we're experiencing is a lot of displacement and who's going to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. Transit-oriented development, I think, has some of the biggest benefits in terms of access to jobs, but if only people like myself can afford to live around them, is it really benefiting everyone? So, I live 2 blocks from a metro station in DC. And so I don't have to own a car. I get to save things. I also, I am a new resident, and I'm watching my neighbors who have lived there for 30 years not be able to keep up with the property taxes and not feel like this community is theirs anymore. And they're being displaced into the suburbs and not able to take advantage of the fact that we live 2 blocks from the metro anymore. And they are actually homeowners. That's what's so interesting. But the property taxes are getting so high. So it's just something to think about is as we're building these places, how do we create great places and for who? And that's what I think about. I had to show a little hometown pride because that's Seattle. But also this is a picture of Westchester. Does anyone recognize this? So, it's already here. And this is, I picked this picture on purpose because there are cars there, but there are also more than there are cars, which I think, there are people. And it's so important to think about people. So what's really interesting is we were recently doing this big search of creating this presentation where we were looking at a lot of main streets and places. And what I noticed again and again in the pictures is people aren't there. People aren't in a lot of pictures when you have design renderings. And at the end of the day, we're creating places for people, and we want to create great places for all people. And so I think that's kind of what I want to leave you at, is to remember what we're doing, and it requires everyone in this room, whether you're working with older adults or you're working with new mobility or development or transportation, or you're working in bike and ped, or you're working in transit, that you've got, we're all part of this, but at the end of the day, we are creating places. And with that, I will leave my contact information up there. All right, thank you.